Hi there, I'm Todd Leet, and welcome to U.S. History with Leet. Today we're going to talk about the first government of the United States, but first, let's get the PowerPoint open so you can follow along at home. Go ahead and open your browsers and point them to my website, www.toddleet.com. Once you're there, go ahead and click on U.S. History, because that's the course we're talking about today, and then you want to scroll down to this set of notes. So go down to unit number 6 Alt, Creating a Government. Click on PowerPoint, and that will open today's lesson in a new window that you can go ahead and follow along with me. But first, let's get into 6 Alt, Creating a Government. All right, what we're going to talk about today is how the United States government that we have today was created. And our story actually goes back to just after our founding, after we declare independence from Great Britain. So when that happens, the United States is run by the Second Continental Congress. That's the organization that's running the war, supplying the troops, raising money, making deals with countries like France to join the war on our side. That's the government of the United States. But once we've pretty much won the war, the Second Continental Congress turns their attention to creating a new permanent government for the United States. And that is something they create called the Articles of Confederation. So we'll start by talking about that. However, that government does not last for very long because of problems that we'll talk about, and it is soon replaced by the U.S. Constitution. That is the government that we still have in effect here today in America. So we're going to talk about how we go from a government called the Articles of Confederation, which are not very effective and poorly planned, to the current government that's been in effect for over 200 years, the U.S. Constitution. All right, before we get into the notes, I've put together some big questions that we need to consider and think about throughout the lesson. So first, what was the first national government established in the new United States, and what are the weaknesses of that government? Why is that government replaced after only a few years of being in effect? Then we'll talk about the U.S. Constitution, the current government of the United States. How is the U.S. Constitution different from our first government here in the United States? And how is the U.S. Constitution a product of compromise? How is it that different people from all around the new United States come together to create this government? And what are the deals that are made behind the scenes that allow the states to agree to it? So, if we're thinking about these questions throughout the lesson, and by the time we're done, we can answer them, then we've done what we need to do here today. So our story begins shortly after the United States has declared independence from Great Britain. And as I mentioned, the government of the United States, when we declare independence at that time, is the Second Continental Congress. So it's the Second Continental Congress that does the running of the war. You know, they pick Washington to be the general, they raise funds and draft troops. They're the ones who are negotiating peace with Great Britain. So it's the Second Continental Congress that's doing all of that work to get us our independence. But once the war is won, the Second Continental Congress turns their attention to creating a new permanent government for the United States. And as they're doing that, there is talk about what type of government the United States should have. So, there's some people who believe that we should have a monarchy, have a king, and let the king make all the decisions, and as long as you have a good king, everything will be okay. But we're not going to do that because we just fought the Revolutionary War against a king, and we're not real interested in that. Another option, a constitutional monarchy. Now that's what Great Britain has. In Great Britain, there is the king, and today a queen, but they don't have full power. A lot of the power rests within the parliament. And so you vote for your members of parliament, they make the laws, and the king is more of a figurehead. But again, we don't want a monarch, even if it's a weakened monarch. So a constitutional monarchy, that's not going to work. How about a theocracy? Okay, a theocracy is when religious leaders make the rules and laws for a country, and those laws are based off whatever religion it happens to be. No, that's not going to work. We kind of like religious freedom in this country, so we can't do that. How about a democracy? How about a direct democracy? We have every American vote on everything. It's a nice idea, but it's not really practical, So we talked about direct democracies a lot when we were talking about New England, and we said that New England has some direct democracies, even through to today, but they're small towns, like a couple hundred people live in a village, and it's easy to get everybody together to take a vote on whether or not the village should raise taxes or build a bridge or whatever, but you can't get every single American to vote on every single thing. It's just not practical. Even back then, when the United States was small in size, 13 states, only several hundred miles north to south, even then, it's just not possible to get every single American to vote on everything. No, a democracy is nice because we do like the people to have power and to vote, but we're not going to be able to get every American, whether it's 1781 or 2018. We're not going to get every single American to participate in government. So instead, what people believe we should have is a republic. Now, a republic is a type of government where the people have the power and they elect representatives to serve them in government. So instead of me voting on everything, me deciding by way of voting on whether we should raise taxes, give money to schools, build a new aircraft carrier, all those kind of things that government does. Instead of me being asked every single thing, because I don't have time for that, I got to make these videos and play fantasy football and nap. I don't have time for that. So instead, I vote for representatives, and those representatives go to Congress. They go to the House of Representatives. They go to the U.S. Senate. I vote for a president. And it's those individuals that make those decisions. Congress goes off and decides, what our tax rate is going to be. And Congress decides if we should declare war against another country. The president picks the judges, so I don't have to, figure out who would make a really good judge for the federal court. There's people for that. And so we, in a republic, elect our leaders, and depending on whether or not they do well or not, we may re-elect them, or we may throw them out of office and replace them with somebody else. That's how a republic works. Now, that is very, very practical for a large nation like the new United States or the current United States, because we've got 320 plus million Americans today. You can't possibly get every single one of them to be informed on every topic and to have the ability and the time to vote. So instead, we have a couple elections every couple years, and we pick representatives and senators, and they go off and they vote for us. And if you're a good citizen, you keep an eye on them. You make sure that they're voting for things that you agree with. And if they don't go the way you want them to, you vote for somebody else. If you're happy with what they do, you keep them around. And that's why we have elections every 2 years. So we elect the House of Representatives every 2 years, and you elect your senators in your state every 6 years. So you got 2 senators per state, you got 1 representative locally, so you're always voting for somebody every couple years. And then that way you can kind of keep an eye on them. And if they don't vote the way you want, get rid of them. That's a republic. And so that's the type of government that the United States is going to have, partly because we're too large. And quite honestly, back in the day, the founders didn't really think that the average American would have been smart enough to vote on every little topic themselves. Now, some of it has to do with intelligence, but I don't agree with that. I think more of it has to do with just not having information. In the age before the internet and daily newspapers, whether they're printed or online, it's really tough to know what's happening all around the country. So back in the day, you couldn't be expected to know, if you live in Georgia, what's best for New York, because it's just too far away. So instead of that, you vote for your representatives. They'll be informed. They'll make decisions. Keep an eye on them, and either vote or don't vote for them. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a republic. We're going to create what's also called a representative democracy. So a direct democracy, every American votes on everything. Not practical. A representative democracy is you vote for your representatives, and then they will vote on the matters of government. And so that's what we have. America is a republic or a representative democracy. America is not a regular democracy, a direct democracy. We are a representative democracy, or as most people call it, a republic. As the Second Continental Congress assembles and begins to debate how to create a new government for the United States, one of the questions that they've got to consider is, how do we create a government that works for all 13 states? So all of the states in the new United States are different. They have different populations. Some have got a lot of people, some have a few people. Some of them are very, very large in land, like square miles. Some of them are kind of small. And some of them have lots and lots of money, people with high incomes. And some of them have got people who are a little bit poorer. So how do we create a government that works for all of these people? And then the question is, we know that we want to be a republic. So people are going to be voting for their representatives. But how many representatives does everybody get? Should we have it so that every state gets 1? Well, is that fair to the big states? I don't know. Should we have it that everybody, gets a number of representatives based off of how many people live there? So like if you have a big state with lots of people, you get lots of representatives? Well, that might be fair, but then what if you're a small state? Is it your fault that you're just tiny? Does that mean that you'll never win anything because there's not enough of you? Maybe that might be a problem too. So they got to figure that out. And then the other question is, at the end of the day, who's the boss? Who's the boss around here? So no one's ever made a government like this before. And what they've got to decide is, where does the buck stop? And by that I mean, like, who's the top of the food chain? Like, who's the last decision maker? Where is it that you can't go any higher? You know? So is it the states that are on top and they create the national government to work for them? So, like, if a state says something, that's the last say? Or is it the other way around? But the national government is on top and all the states have to do what it says. Because you can't have two bosses, you know? You got to have one final say in things. So if somebody says jump, you got to say how high. If the national government says pay some taxes and you say no, there have to be consequences to that. So we got to figure out, how is this going to work? Does the national government work for the states, or are the states underneath the national government? Where's this? You know, what's the food chain? What's, you know, who reports to who? Who's boss? And you think about it in the military. You know, there's rankings. You know, there's ranks. It says, you know, that the sergeant reports to the lieutenant reports, you know, to the captain reports to the colonel reports to the general. I think I got that right. You know, in school, I'm a teacher. I report to an assistant principal. The assistant principal reports to the principal. The principal of the building has got an assistant superintendent that they have to listen to. And the assistant superintendent listens to the superintendent of the entire school district. You know, like, we've got some sort of order. So, same question here in the United States. Who's the boss? Is it the states that tell the national government what to do? Or is it the other way around? The national government tells the states what to do. That's a decision that we're going to have to make. So after some debate, the Second Continental Congress creates the first government of the United States, and that's called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation is the first government of the United States, and it goes into effect in March of 1781. Its goal was to create an alliance almost of the 13 states, like a league of friendship almost, so that you'd have these 13 states that are all sort of working together under the umbrella of the Articles of Confederation. So it's trying to divide powers between things that are national, and that's stuff that the Articles would allow the national government to do, and then things that are only for the states. And this is a very, very weak national government. The Articles do not give the national government a lot of power. And the reason that the Articles of Confederation are so weak is because you have to remember, we just ended the Revolutionary War against a very, very powerful nation, Great Britain. And our fear was that if we created a government that was too powerful, it would take us down the same road as Great Britain. It would abuse our rights, it would turn around and tax us to death, and that's not what anybody wanted after the Revolutionary War. So instead, they purposefully created a government that was very weak, that did not have a lot of power. It could not do a lot of things. So the new national government under the Articles, it could declare war against other countries and then make peace with other countries, make treaties with them. It could borrow money and it could print or coin money, but they couldn't tax. The only way that the national government got any money coming in was by way of asking the states for it. And that's all they could do is ask. They could call Massachusetts up and say, hey, Massachusetts, we could use some money for fill in the blank. Will you give us some money? And it was up to Massachusetts to say yes or no. You couldn't force anyone to pay taxes. Again, they don't want a government that has too much power, because if it has too much power, like the power to tax you, it could turn corrupt, and we don't want that. They could set up a postal system, and it was allowed to deal with the Indians, to make deals with them so we could get some land. And that's it. That's all the Articles of Confederation allow for. It's a very, very weak national government on purpose. The problem with that, though, is we're going to find out very quickly that it's too weak, that it needs to have a little bit of bite. And so the Articles, while they're created in the shadow of war, they're created because we just got done fighting the British and we don't want a government like theirs that's too powerful. What we find is that we went the opposite direction too far. Instead of creating one that was super powerful like the British, we went in the total wrong direction, and we created one that is so weak that it was pretty much pointless to exist. And there's several other problems with the Articles that we're kind of going to get into. Very quickly, after the Articles of Confederation went into effect, its flaws became very clear. And one of those biggest flaws was the way in which Congress worked. So, in the Articles, it set up a one house Congress. So, it's not like today where we have two houses of Congress, a House of Representatives and a Senate. Under the Articles, there's just one house, just Congress. And it was set up so that every state of the 13 states got one representative in Congress. So Massachusetts would have one representative. Pennsylvania had one representative. New Jersey, one representative. You get the idea. And because 13 was an odd number, all they had to do was vote on everything, and someone would win because 13 is an odd number. So when they decided, what they were going to do, the government would just vote on it, and whoever had the most votes would win. And again, there were only 13 votes to count. That's not necessarily fair, though, and here's why. So there's 13 states, but they all have drastically different populations. So for example, Massachusetts is not a very large state as far as square miles go, but there are a lot of people who live there. Inside the state of Massachusetts in the 1780s, there's about 235,000 people living there. It's a pretty good number. Now, down in Georgia, the southernmost state at the time, it's a very large state. Lots of square miles, but a very small population, only 23,000 people. But each of those states only got one vote. So, if you were in Georgia, you would know that there are 10 times as many people who live in Massachusetts, but you got one vote just like them. So if Massachusetts wanted to do something, they could be blocked by a small state with hardly any people like Georgia. And Massachusetts would say that's not fair. Now, Georgia thought it was good because that kept a big state like Massachusetts from having too much power. But if you're a state like Massachusetts with lots of people, their citizens think, well, this isn't very fair. So that's one problem, is that everyone's got one vote no matter how big or small your state is. The other problem is that if you wanted to change the articles, you wanted to make an amendment to the articles, you had to get all 13 states to agree. And that was almost impossible. You'd never get all 13 states to agree on something. You might have something where like the New England states think something is a good idea, but some of the southern states would think it's a bad idea, or the middle colonies, or middle states. So the issue here is it's almost impossible to change the articles. In fact, the articles are never changed because that level of having to have 13 of them agree is just impossible to get. And then here's the biggest one. The articles forbid the national government from collecting taxes. So the Revolutionary War was expensive for the United States. To fight that war, to put soldiers in uniforms and guns and wagons and cannonballs and all that stuff, it cost money. Money that we didn't have, so we borrowed money from lots of people. We borrowed money from people and we borrowed money from other countries. Now that the war's over, those people would like paid back. But here's the problem. The United States doesn't have any money. The states have money. Massachusetts has money, Pennsylvania has money, Virginia has money, but the United States government itself doesn't have any because it's not allowed to tax anybody. So what they would do is this. They'd ask states for money. So they'd call up, Pennsylvania. Hey, Pennsylvania, well, we need some cash to pay back somebody. And Pennsylvania would be like, I'm not really good on money right now. Can't help you out. So Pennsylvania would say no. So then they'd get a hold of Massachusetts. Hey, Massachusetts, we need some money. Will you give us money? And Massachusetts would be like, well, what did Pennsylvania do? And, the government would be like, well, they said no. Well, we're going to say no too. Why would we pay if they're not going to pay? That's stupid. So then nobody gives the government any money because nobody wants to be the first chump who does so. So the national government basically has no money. They're completely broke, but they owe money still. So that's a problem. And then finally, other countries like Great Britain and France, Great Britain and Spain, they're on our borders. They're all around us, and they kind of push us around because we're young, and they think that they can, kind of take advantage of us, and they can see that our government is not working real well, and that we're kind of bothered by, trying to deal with that, and so they're able to take advantage of us in a couple ways. That aren't super important for the lesson, but just good to know that other countries see that we have a weak government and they kind of screw with us a little bit. So the articles are not a good government. They've got all sorts of problems. Part of it's representation because it's one state, one vote, which is not fair for big states compared to small states. It can't tax anybody, so it has no money coming in, and nobody voluntarily gives it money. And then finally, other countries just mess with us because they know that we're too weak to do anything about it. We have an army, but we have no money to supply it. So if England wanted to, they could invade us again. Thankfully, they don't. But I mean, they could, and we wouldn't have any way to fight them back since we had no money to buy uniforms or guns or anything to fight them. So it's not a good government. It's not a good government, and very quickly people realize, we screwed this thing up. We might need to make a new one. So here's a chart that illustrates the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Number one is Congress doesn't have the power to tax anybody. All they can do is ask states to just give them money. And almost always those states say no, because nobody wants to be the first chump to turn over cash when the other 12 states say no. And so almost always they say no, and the national government is pretty much always broke. Another problem is that Congress can't regulate trade, meaning business, that takes place between states or between the United States and foreign countries. I don't want to get too far into that because it does kind of get a little bit technical, but basically here's what would happen. Two states would get mad at each other, and then they would put taxes on each other's stuff as punishment. You can't have that. Now, if today that were to happen, if two states had a disagreement, they'd go to the U.S. government, and the U.S. government would act like a referee and settle whatever their problem is. However, back then, the national government couldn't settle any disputes between anybody. Another problem, as we mentioned, there's only one Congress, and every state has one vote, no matter how big or small your state is. That makes the small states happy, but it makes the big states, states with large populations, upset because they feel like, we got a lot of people who live here, we should have more power. But no, you only get one vote. If you want to make any laws under the Articles, it takes 2/3 of the states to pass a law. So 9 out of 13 states, not just 50% majority, but 9 out of 13 is 2/3. Difficult to do that. If you wanted to amend the Articles, maybe create some sort of rule that allowed the national government to collect taxes, you'd have to amend the Articles for that, because in the Articles it said the national government can't collect taxes. But let's say you wanted to change it. Let's say you wanted to amend the Articles to allow the national government to collect taxes. You could do that, but it would take all 13 states to say yes. And again, that's impossible, so it never happens. The Articles are never amended because you can't get 13 states to agree on anything. So it's hard to make simple laws, and it's impossible to make amendments. There's no executive branch, which means there was no president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. So the job of the president is to enforce laws. Congress makes laws, and then it's the executive branch that enforces them, right? So for example, taxes. So Congress comes up with our tax code. They decide how much money you and I pay in taxes. That's the legislative branch. They make the laws. It's the executive branch that enforces them. So when I pay my taxes, I pay them to the Department of the Treasury, the IRS. And so they are an executive branch. So Congress makes laws, the president's departments enforce those laws. But under the Articles, there is no president of the United States. So Congress could make laws, but there's nobody to make anyone actually follow them. So there's no president. There's no national court system either. So, we use the courts to settle legal disputes between people. And if two states have a legal dispute, they go to the national courts, who again act like a referee. There's no national court system under the Articles of Confederation either. And these 13 states, they are also independent. There's no unity. They are part of the United States, but they don't think of themselves as one country. They look at themselves as New York, and they're friends with Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania looks at itself as independent. Pennsylvania is Pennsylvania. They're friends with Virginia. There's no national idea of the United States. It's basically 13 separate states that are like little mini countries, and we're all friends with each other, but nobody thinks of us as one big country overall. And that's a problem. That's a problem. And it's because the Articles are so weak, nobody feels like we're all in this thing together. I got to look out for my own before you hurt me, basically. And that's no good. That's no good. So the Articles, they're a failure. They're not a good government, and they're going to need to be replaced. It should really come as no surprise to anybody that the Articles of Confederation were a failure, because they were purposefully created to be very, very weak and ineffective. So the people who created this government were afraid of a government with too much power that would abuse them in the states. So instead they created a very weak national government. And that's what the Articles of Confederation were, a weak national government that did not allow the national government to tax anyone, that could not settle disagreements between the states. So what we end up seeing is that they had intended to create a government that didn't have a lot of power because they were afraid of that power going awry. But instead, they kind of went the opposite direction and created a government that was so weak that it really couldn't do anything. And if it's so weak that it can't do anything, why does it even exist? So what a lot of people start talking about is maybe we should try and change these articles or scrap them and start over with a brand new government altogether. One of the side effects of the Articles of Confederation being so weak was they were unable to settle disputes between states. So oftentimes the states would have disagreements with each other, and the way in which they would lash out at other states was to raise very high taxes on things that would come from those states. And the national government was absolutely powerless to stop this from happening because it couldn't act as a referee between states and it couldn't raise its own taxes. So the national government basically was, like on the sidelines watching all this happen and couldn't stop it. So members of different states decided to get together in Philadelphia in May of 1787 and start talking about how can we fix the Articles? What changes need to be made so that this government can actually work? Because right now, the states are fighting with each other at all times. The government is almost bankrupt because it has no real money. How are we going to fix the problems with the Articles? And so 12 out of 13 states, Rhode Island doesn't send any representatives, decide to meet at this convention that's going to be held in Philadelphia in, again, May of 1787. We call this the Constitutional Convention. It's called the Constitutional Convention because very soon after getting there, most of the delegates realize the Articles are just too broken, that they are not repairable, that there's too many flaws with them to actually go and try and revise them. But we'd be much better off to just throw them away and create a brand new government that doesn't have the same flaws as the Articles. And the people who are there for this meeting are some really, really influential historic figures in American history. Ben Franklin is there. George Washington is there and is actually going to be the president of the Constitutional Convention. So he'll sit in the front with a gavel and kind of like run the meetings. And then some other characters we've not talked about, but are major characters in American history will be there as well. James Madison, fourth president of the United States, is there. And also Alexander Hamilton, first secretary of the Treasury and a former lieutenant to Washington during the Revolutionary War. He'll be there as a delegate from the state of New York. So it's this Constitutional Convention that very, very quickly realizes that the Articles are beyond saving and we're going to need to create a brand new government. And that is exactly what these folks are going to do in Philadelphia in 1787. Once they begin the meeting, the delegates decide that the question that they've really got to settle right off the bat is how are we going to balance the needs of the big states versus the small states? So under the Articles of Confederation, the way the Congress worked was every state got one vote no matter how big or small your state was. And when I say big or small, I'm talking about population, meaning like how many people live in your state. So whether your state had a lot of people, like Virginia, or your state had very, very few people, like Delaware, you got one vote. And for the big states, they believed that this was not fair. Why is it that a state like Massachusetts has, something like 235,000 people living in it, and they get one vote just like little Georgia does with 23,000 people? I mean, there's 10 times as many people living in Massachusetts, so shouldn't they have 10 times as number of votes? Shouldn't Massachusetts have 10 votes in Congress and Georgia have one? Wouldn't that be more fair because they have 10 times as many people? Shouldn't they have 10 times as representatives? I mean, that's what the big states want. But the little states, like Georgia, they have a small population. They know that if they only have one representative, they're not going to have any power at all because they'll get outvoted by the big states every day. So that's a problem. How are we going to balance that? Because if we come up with a system that is good for the big states, the small states won't agree to it. And if we come up with a system that's good for the small states, the big states are going to think that's not fair and they're not going to agree with it either. So the Articles of Confederation, because it is one state, one vote, it does favor the small states. And the big states are right. That's not fair to them. So we got to find a way in order to balance their needs. We got to make it fair for everybody. The other thing is we've got to find a way to kind of create laws in a more fair way. We don't want a situation where only the big states or only the small states have control over laws that are made. So we're going to have to find some balance in that too. Again, we're talking about balancing the needs of the big and versus small states. How can we make this fair for everyone? That's what they've got to figure out. It's at this point that James Madison of Virginia, Virginia is a large state, by the way, lots of people, he introduces what he calls the Virginia Plan. And so his Virginia Plan is for setting up the government under what's called a bicameral legislature. So let's break that down. Bi means two, like bicycle, and cameral means house. So a two-house legislature. This would be where the laws are made. So under the Virginia Plan of James Madison, we're going to have a bicameral legislature, a two-house legislature that has two equal houses. So one would be the House and the other would be the Senate. And for a bill to become a law, you've got to get it past both houses. So the lower house or the House of Representatives would have to agree to a bill, and the exact same copy would have to pass the upper house or the Senate. Okay, that's how our government works today. But here's the difference. The Virginia Plan called for the number of representatives in the House and the number of senators in the Senate to be decided by the population of each state. So if your state had a lot of people, you would get a lot of representatives. And if your state had a lot of people, you would get a lot of senators on both sides. So the House of Representatives and the Senate would be your bicameral, two houses of Congress. And again, the number of people you would get in both houses under the Virginia Plan would be based on population. So he comes up with this plan because he's from Virginia, a very large state, and this would be advantageous to his state. Virginia has a very large population, so they would get a lot of representatives in the House of Representatives, and they would get a lot of senators in the Senate under his plan. And because a bill would have to pass both sides to become a law, his state and other large states would have lots of votes, and they would be able to control what happens. Meanwhile, small states with very few votes, because they have very small populations, they would not be able to vote for or against things. So, under the Virginia Plan, this favors the large states. Obviously, the small states don't like it, but the big states with large populations, like Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New York, they like this plan because they will have lots and lots of representatives in both houses of Congress. The more reps they have, the more power they'll have. The more power they'll have, the more things they'll be able to vote for and control. So the Virginia Plan is come up with by James Madison, and it favors the large states. The Virginia Plan favors the large states because it's based off of population. Of course, the Virginia Plan is not going to be found to be acceptable by the small states, so they put forward their own plan, which is called the New Jersey Plan. So the New Jersey Plan is developed by this individual, William Patterson of New Jersey. Now, New Jersey is a small state. They have a small population, so their plan favors the small states. Under Patterson's New Jersey Plan, the Congress would be unicameral. So una means one and cameral means house. So there would be only one house of Congress. There would not be two, there'd only be one, just like under the Articles of Confederation. And every state would get one vote, no matter how big or small their state was. So again, this is like the Articles of Confederation again. So the larger states do not like this plan. They say, what do you think we're in this room for? The articles did not work, and you're proposing the articles again. You're saying that every state gets one vote, no matter how big or small they are, and that there would only be one house of Congress. So, small states would have an advantage here. A small state like New Jersey or a small state like Georgia with a low population would have just as much power as a large state like Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania. And that would give them equal power, meaning just as likely for them to pass something as the large states. So the New Jersey Plan is good for the small states. So now we've got a problem. And that problem is the New Jersey Plan is good for the small states, but the big states won't vote for it. And the Virginia Plan is good for the big states, but the small states won't work for it. So when you have two plans that are competing and neither side is willing to budge on what it is that they believe is the right thing to do because the opposite plan would hurt them, you're going to need some sort of compromise. The two sides are deadlocked and we need some sort of compromise. We're going to need the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan to somehow merge together in some new plan that both sides would find acceptable. This is a small graph that shows the two plans that are on the table for the people at the Constitutional Convention to consider. So on the left we have the Virginia plan by James Madison. So it calls for a unicameral, meaning two-house Congress, and the number of people who will represent the states on each of the houses is decided by population. So at the lower and upper house, you can refer to them, the House of Representatives and the Senate, whatever you like, the number of people who will represent your state in each one of them is decided by population. So this gives an advantage to the large states. The more people who live in your state, the more representatives you'll have on both sides. The more representatives you have, the greater chance you have of getting things voted for that you want. The other option is the New Jersey plan. This is favored by the small states. It calls for a unicameral or one house section of Congress. Every state, no matter how big or small your state is, lots of people or little people, not little people, but you get what I'm saying, lots of people or very few people, you're going to get one vote no matter what. This is good for the small states because they can have just as much power as large states like Virginia, New York, or Pennsylvania. So these are our two plans. These two competing plans have led to a deadlock at the Constitutional Convention. The large states favor the Virginia plan, the small states favor the New Jersey plan, and neither side wants to vote for the other one because it would hurt them. So what we're going to need is a compromise, and that compromise is put forward by a man from Connecticut named Roger Sherman. So Sherman comes up with what is called sometimes the Connecticut Plan, or sometimes called the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise, as we will refer to it, takes both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan and blends them together into something that can be acceptable for both sides. So, under the Connecticut Plan, the Great Compromise by Roger Sherman, under the Great Compromise, it calls for a bicameral legislature. So again, bicameral means two houses. So there'll be a House of Representatives and a U.S. Senate. Now, on the House side, they will determine the number of representatives your state gets by population. So if your state has a lot of people living in it, you will get a lot of representatives in the House of Representatives. However, the other side of Congress, the Senate, will have its number of senators determined not by population, but by equal representation, which means we give every state the same number of senators. Now, in this case, we've come up with a number of 2. That's how many we have in the United States. Every state, no matter if you're a large state or a small state, a lot of people or very few people, every state gets 2 senators. That comes from the New Jersey plan. And the idea of the House of Representatives being based off population, that comes from the Virginia plan. So we've taken the 2 plans and we've merged them together to create one that might be acceptable to both. And in order for a bill to become a law, you've got to have it pass both houses of Congress. So let's say you want to create a law that would, put a tax on watermelons. I don't know. I just thought of watermelons for some reason. Now, in order to get that tax on watermelons to pass, you would have to get it past the House of Representatives, which means if the House of Representatives is controlled by big states, then the big states would have to agree to your watermelon tax. But it's not a law yet. It also has to pass the Senate. Now, the Senate, because they have an equal number of senators from every state, has more control there by the small states. So the small states would also have to agree to your watermelon tax. If you came up with a tax that was not acceptable to either large or small states, that bill would not pass in either the House or the Senate. So it forces you, the Great Compromise, it forces you to only come up with laws that are acceptable for both sides. So for a bill to become a law, it's got to pass the House of Representatives, where it's based off population and it's good for the big states, and it has to pass the Senate, which is equal representation. Every state gets 2 senators if you're big or small. That's good for the small states. So laws can only be created if they pass both the House and the Senate, which means they have to be good for both big states and small states. This is why we call it the Great Compromise. We have taken the best ideas of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, the plan that's good for the big states and the plan that's good for the small states, and we've merged them together into one new plan that is agreeable to both. This is how our government was created. This is how it still works today with the House of Representatives based off population. So large states, for example, California has the most number of representatives because they have the most number of people living there. And then we have small states like Wyoming. There's one representative for Wyoming. Why? Very small population. But on the flip side, the Senate has equal representation. So even though California has the most number of people in the country, they get 2 senators, just like Wyoming, with a very small population, also gets 2 senators. And the 2 senators from Wyoming are just as powerful as the 2 senators from California. That is why this system works. The House of Representatives can be swayed by the big states, and the Senate can be swayed by the small states. And you can't make a law without it passing both, which means you can't make laws that is not liked by one of the 2 sides. This is the Great Compromise. And here we have our Capitol today. So on the left-hand side, that side of the building, the U.S. Capitol, is the House of Representatives. There, the number of representatives is decided by population. The more people who live in your state, the more representatives in the House of Representatives you get. On the right-hand side of the Capitol is the U.S. Senate. There, no matter how large or small your state is in population, you get the same number of senators, 2. In order for a bill to become a law, whether it's the watermelon example I gave you, any type of tax, whether you want to come up with a law that gives free health care to Americans, doesn't matter what it is. If you want to come up with a law, it has to pass both houses. It has to pass the House and it has to pass the Senate. And if the House is controlled by people from large states and the Senate is controlled by people from small states, the only way you're going to get anything to become a law is if something is agreeable to both sides. And that is really the genius of the Great Compromise. The biggest stumbling block at the Constitutional Convention was the representation issue. However, once the Great Compromise is reached, they can move on to some other issues. And one of those issues is slavery. So the southern states are the ones that still have slavery at this time. Slavery is no longer legal in the northern states, but the southern states still have slavery. And the southern states say, okay, if the House of Representatives is going to be decided by population, meaning the number of people who live in our state equal how many representatives we get, we would like to count our slaves as people toward that number so we can have more reps. And the northern states think that this is not a fair idea or a right idea because the southern states don't consider their slaves citizens. They don't have the same rights as white people, meaning they can't vote, they don't pay taxes, they don't have any freedom. So if they're not people, why would you count them as people toward your population? Well, the South wants to do this not because they're being nice, but because they want to have an inflated population so they'll get more representatives. They're being greedy, basically. So what they're saying is, yeah, our slaves, they're not citizens. They don't get to vote. They don't really have freedom. But we still want to count them as people toward representation. And the North says, no can do. That's not fair. They're not citizens. They can't vote. They don't pay taxes. They don't have freedom. You can't count them toward your total population so you get more reps. You're cheating. And the Southerners say, well, either let us count our slaves as people toward our population so we get more reps, or we're not going to agree to this Constitution and we'll just go start our own country. Well, that's a problem. We can't have not all the states in. We got to have the southern states. We have to have Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland. We got to have the southern states. So otherwise there's no point in making a document because we don't have a country. So we got to have the southern states. So what that means is we're going to need another compromise. So the southern states want to count their slaves toward their total population. But it doesn't seem fair since they're not people. So the compromise is this. You can count your slaves, but you can't count all of them toward your population. You can only count 3/5 or 60% of your population of slaves toward your total population overall. It's a weird calculation. So basically it works like this. let's say you have 100,000 slaves in your state. And this is a low number. Lots of states have, hundreds of thousands of slaves by the time the Civil War starts, but whatever. Let's just say 100,000. You have 100,000 slaves in your state. You cannot just add 100,000 to your total population and get more reps. That's not fair. So the 3/5 compromise is you count up all your slaves and you can add 3/5 of that number to your total population, or 60%. So if you have 100,000 slaves, you add 60,000 to your total population. If you have 1,000,000, you can add 600,000 to your total population. You get the idea? 3/5 is 60%. So you count up all your slaves and you can add 3/5 or 60% of that number to your total number so you can have more reps. This is another compromise. It's not a great compromise, but it's the one that's necessary to get the southern states to join on the Constitution. Because if we tell them, meaning Northerners, if we tell them, no, you can't count your slaves at all, then they're just going to walk and leave the convention and start their own country, and then we're going to have two countries in America, and we can't do that. It's just not going to work. So in order to keep the southern states on board and allow them to have a couple extra representatives, we allow them to count 3/5 of their slaves. This is called the 3/5 compromise. So with the issue of representation out of the way, it's time to turn our attention to an idea called checks and balances. So the government is created with three co-equal branches of government, and these branches of government all have their own unique responsibilities. Those branches are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So let's go over these one at a time. Let's start with the executive branch. The executive branch is the President of the United States. Now you remember, there was no president under the Articles of Confederation, so this is a new job. So the executive branch, led by the President, is the branch of government that enforces laws, and they run the military, amongst other things. So to enforce the laws means you are the group of people that make the laws happen. So I pay taxes to the IRS, the Treasury Department. That is an executive department. Let's say you make a law about not being allowed to dump oil, motor oil, down your drain. Okay, so Congress would make that law. That'd be the legislative branch. Congress would make the law, but the people who would enforce that law would be the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. That's an executive branch. So the executive branch is the president and those departments. They're the ones who make the laws happen, basically. Okay. The legislative branch is the Congress. They're the ones who create and pass the laws. So they're basically like the ideas, and the president makes the ideas happen. That's a good way of looking at it. Okay, so the Congress creates laws and the president puts them into action. He makes them, or she makes them happen. And then finally, the judicial branch is the courts. It's the courts that decide if the laws that are created are fair and constitutional. They decide if the laws are well written, they decide if the laws make sense, and they decide if the laws are okay against the Constitution. And we'll talk a lot about checking on laws a little bit later. So what you want to do is keep all three of these branches equally powerful, and none of them more powerful than the other. So you have to have three branches that are co-equal. That's what checks and balances are. Checks and balances are the things that one branch of government can do to stop one of the other ones from doing something wrong or having too much power. So you don't want the president to have too much power, you don't want the Congress to have too much power, and you don't want the courts to have too much power. So each of them can watch the other. Think of it as a triangle with all of these groups watching each other at the same time. I'm watching you, you're watching me, we're both watching him. That's checks and balances. You got three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, and they all have the ability to watch the other two and make sure that they follow the rules and they don't get too powerful. That's what our system is built for. So now let's take a look at some of those checks and balances. Here's a chart that just shows some, but not all, of the checks and balances. So this grid goes in three directions. First, we've got the three branches going from top to bottom: the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. And then when it says checks on, that means that that branch can do something to the other two to make them not so powerful or to dial them back a little bit. So for example, let's look at executive branch real quick here. So the executive branch can stop the legislative branch by doing things like vetoing laws. So if the legislature tries to create a law that the executive, the president, doesn't like, he or she can veto that law. That is a check. The executive also has a check on the judicial branch by being the ones who appoint the judges. So judges don't run for election. Judges get picked to do that job by the president. So the president can kind of control the court system by getting to pick who he or she wants to be a judge. So you get to control the judges by picking them. Now, once they have the job, they can do whatever they want, but you're the one as the president who gets to decide who should be a judge. That means you kind of control the judicial branch a little bit. And you can control the legislative branch a little bit by vetoing the laws that you don't like that they come up with. Now, the legislative, we're on level 2 now, they have the ability to make the laws and they can check the executive. So if the president vetoes a law, they can actually override the president's veto by taking a second vote, and if they get even more votes the second time, what's called a supermajority, a 2/3 vote of Congress, and we'll talk about that another day, they can actually override the president's veto. So they can check the president by overriding his veto. They can check the president by impeaching the president. If the president commits crimes, he doesn't, or she doesn't get to stay president forever. You, as the legislature, can remove that president. That is a check on presidential power, meaning they cannot be above the law. They can be removed if they should break the law. The legislative branch also can check the president's power because when the president picks those judges we talked about, they don't get the job unless the Senate says, okay, they can have the job. So you can kind of control the president by making sure he doesn't pick too much of a wild card to become a judge. The legislative branch, that's also a check on the judicial. The legislative branch can also check on the judicial by impeaching judges that are corrupt. You know, if a judge goes and takes bribes and says, you know, hey, if you throw me a bribe, I'll find you not guilty. Guess what? Super illegal, and you can be removed, impeached by Congress for something like that. And then the judicial branch, level 3, they have checks on the legislature and the executive as well because they can declare things that the president or Congress does as illegal and against the law. So each of the branches can stop the other one when they get to be a little bit too powerful, and that's the beauty of our system. Checks and balances make it so that no one branch can have too much power. The president can be stopped by the Congress, the legislative branch. The Congress can be stopped by the president. The courts can stop both of them. The president can control the courts. The legislature can control the president as he's making appointments to the courts. It's a very complicated weave, but at the end, it makes it so that no one side has too much power. That's what checks and balances are all about. One last part of the Constitution that I want to talk about today is how we pick our president, and that is through a system called the Electoral College. So, the people who created our Constitution, the people we call the founders, knew that the president was going to be a very, very important position. However, they were afraid about leaving the selection of the president up to the regular citizens of the country. They thought that two things. One, they thought the average citizen was not smart enough, informed, educated enough to choose a smart person to be president, like they wouldn't be able to physically figure out who they should vote for. And then they were also afraid that people would just vote for the guy who was from their home state, and they wouldn't vote for someone maybe better, or they wouldn't vote for someone they didn't know about. So people from Pennsylvania would only vote for Pennsylvanians, people from New York would only vote for New Yorkers, and so they didn't want people voting for the president of the United States. And so instead of a direct election, which is what they did not want, they came up with this Electoral College. And so this is something that a lot of average people still don't know. We do not directly vote for the president of the United States in this country. We don't. You vote for directly your senators, and you vote directly for your House of Representative member, and they just add up whoever has the most votes, and that's who's the representative or that's who's the senator. But we do not do that for President of the United States. No, we have this very complicated system called the Electoral College. And sometimes that means that the person with the most votes doesn't actually win the election. No, here's the way the Electoral College works. What we do is we take a map of the United States, which I'll show you here in a second. We take a map of the United States and we assign each state in the country a number. And then what happens is that number that they are assigned is equal to the number of representatives and the number of senators that state has. And then on election day, in every state, they have an election, and you vote for who you want to be president. So I do vote for who I want to be president in the state of Pennsylvania. And then what they do is whoever wins Pennsylvania's election, they will get all of Pennsylvania's electoral votes. And then they add up the electoral votes from every single state in the country, plus Washington, D.C. And whoever has a majority of those electoral votes, that's who will become the president of the United States. So basically, what we do is we figure out how many electoral votes there are total, and the answer there is 538. And then whoever wins half plus 1 of that number, in which case that's 270, that person, the first person to get 270 electoral votes, they will become president of the United States. Let's take a look at a map and see how that works. What we have here is the current Electoral College map in the United States. So what we have are 50 states plus Washington, D.C., and on top of each one of those states you'll see a number. And that number equals the number of electoral votes each state has. And that number is determined by taking the number of representatives they have in the U.S. House of Representatives plus the number of senators they have in the U.S. Senate. Now, every state has 2 senators, so this math is actually pretty easy to do. Let's take a look at my home state of Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes. So that means that it's 20 minus 2 senators is 18. So we have 18 reps in the House of Representatives, and we have 2 senators in the U.S. Senate, and that equals 20. So on election day, people go and vote in Pennsylvania for who they want to be the president of the United States. So I go vote, along with everybody else in Pennsylvania that wants to vote. And we count the number of votes in Pennsylvania. Whoever wins the election in Pennsylvania gets all 20 of Pennsylvania's electoral votes. So if you win the election in Pennsylvania on that day by 1 vote or 1 million votes, it doesn't matter. You get all 20 of Pennsylvania's electoral votes. And you add that 20 to your bucket if you're running for president. And then what you have to do is fill your bucket up with enough of these states from around the country that you are the first person to get 270 total electoral votes. So what you do is you look at the map and you try to figure out what states do I have to win in order to get to 270 before the other person running for president. We get the number 270 because if you add up all the numbers here on the map, there are 538 total votes. So you need a majority of 538. So a majority is half plus 1. So 538 divided by 2 is 269 plus 1 is 270. So you have to add up enough states to equal 270 electoral votes. Excuse me, as soon as you have 270 votes, you're the winner and you will become the next president of the United States. And this is how the system works. So this is the number of electoral votes that are out there. Now let's take a look and see how the last presidential election worked. In the 2016 presidential election, it was Democrat, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, versus Republican Donald Trump. And unless you've been living underneath a rock, you know that Donald Trump won this election. And if we look here, it's because he got more electoral votes than Secretary Clinton. And so Donald Trump got 306 electoral votes, and Clinton got 232 of them. And you need 270 to win. So 232 is not 270, and so Hillary did not win the election. However, if you take a look at this map, you will see that she did win some fairly large states, like California. 55 electoral votes went to Clinton. She also won New York. 29 votes went to Clinton. So she won some large states like Illinois, 20 votes. However, President Trump won many states, including ones that had small numbers like Montana or Wyoming, but then other states like Pennsylvania with 20, or Wisconsin with 10, and Florida with 29. So what you do is you look at the map and you figure out what states you can and can't win, and then you add them up, and then you come up with some sort of number as to what states you need to win and which ones you can afford to not win and become president. And in this case here, Secretary Clinton lost because she did not win states that Democrats typically win, like Pennsylvania. Democrats typically win Pennsylvania, but she did not. If she had won that, that would have brought her up to 252. She did not win Michigan, which is usually a state won by Democrats, and she did not win Wisconsin, which is almost always won by Democrats. If Secretary Clinton had won Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania instead of President Trump, she would have won the election and not him. So winning the right combination of states can make you president of the United States. However, this should be noted that in this country, we do not elect the president based off of the total number of votes. So it is possible, and it has happened a handful of times, that you can get more votes total in the entire United States, but still lose the election because you don't get enough electoral votes. And that is exactly what happened in this election. So if we look down at the bottom here, I included the popular vote. The popular vote is a popularity contest in that it doesn't matter. This is the number of votes totally cast across the United States, but we don't use this number to determine who the president is. So the popular vote worked out like this. Secretary Clinton had 65,853,514 votes across the entire country. President Trump received 62,984,828 votes across the entire country. So Clinton had more votes than Trump, but Trump won the election because he won the right combination of states. So as I said earlier, if you win a state, it doesn't matter if you win that state by 1 vote or 1 million votes, you get all of its electoral votes. So when Clinton won, she won big. She won a state like California by a huge margin. Trump didn't have a chance there. Conversely, when Trump won, he won by very small margins. It's like Pennsylvania. He won Pennsylvania by only 20,000 votes. Well, it doesn't matter if it was close or not. He still gets all 20 of Pennsylvania's electoral votes. So, in this case, Clinton was able to get a lead in the popular vote, but not in the whole election because she didn't get the majority of the electoral votes. And that really is what matters. That's really what matters. Our Constitution is a very, very interesting document. There's no other government in the world that operates quite like America. And that might be a good thing, and there are days where maybe it's a bad thing. It's hard to say. But it is certainly a unique thing. And as a citizen of the United States, it's important to know how our government works. Well, that'll do it for this lesson, Creating a Government, the Story of the U.S. Constitution. If you happen to find this video helpful, why don't you click the like button? Maybe even hit the subscribe button while you're at it. That way you'll be notified every time I push out a new video. For more PowerPoints like this and sets of notes, information on all the classes I teach, check out my website, www.toddleap.com, your home on the internet for everything Todd Leap. I want to thank you very much for watching. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.